Forbidden Power. The Female Officer's Deadly Affair with a Prisoner True Crime Documentary. Hook. What happens when a powerful officer crosses the line with a dangerous prisoner? A forbidden affair, dark secrets, and a twisted game of control. This isn't just a prison story. It's a fight for survival. Will she break, or will she rise up against the man who has everything on his side? Stay tuned to find out. You won't believe what happens next. Officer Rachel stood by the cell door, eyes fixed on the prisoner. Her heart pounded in her chest. The hallway was empty. Only the low hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. She knew it was wrong. Every part of her screamed it, but she couldn't tear herself away. The man in the cell, Jason, had been serving time for murder. His eyes were cold, but there was something different about him, something that made her stomach twist. She had seen him many times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight he had been quiet. Too quiet. His usual bravado was gone. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for the keys. The door opened with a soft click. Jason didn't move. He just stared at her. There was a strange calmness in his gaze. It made her uneasy. "You're not supposed to be here," Rachel whispered. Jason smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips. "I know," he said softly. The air felt thick, heavy. Rachel stepped back, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her pulse raced as Jason stood, moving toward her with deliberate slowness. He stopped just inches from her. The smell of him was intoxicating. A mix of stale sweat and something darker. "I need to know," he murmured. "Are you afraid of me?" Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She should leave, but she didn't. Her body felt frozen, trapped in that moment. Jason's fingers grazed her wrist. His touch was soft, too soft. She should pull away, but something inside her refused to move. I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Then why are you?" Jason's voice was low, dangerous. Rachel swallowed hard. The walls around her felt like they were closing in. She was trapped, and she knew it. But still, she couldn't stop herself from leaning closer. Jason's lips were inches from her ear. "You want this?" he breathed. The words hit her like a shock. Every instinct screamed to run, but she couldn't. Her hands reached for him. It was a moment of madness. A moment that would change everything. The officer in the doorway froze, eyes wide with disbelief. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, no one moved. Time seemed to stand still. The officer's gaze flicked between Rachel and Jason, the tension thick in the air. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Jason's hand was still gripping her, his touch like a vice. Her body stiffened, but she couldn't pull away. The officer's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his face. "What the hell is going on here?" the officer demanded, his voice tight. Rachel swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice, but it was as if the words had abandoned her. Jason smirked, his grip not loosening. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said, his tone casual, almost mocking. The officer stepped forward, a frown deepening on his face. "I think I have every right to be worried, don't you?" His eyes flicked to Rachel. "You're not supposed to be in here." Rachel's stomach churned with fear. Her mind raced, trying to piece together an escape, a way out. But there was no escape. Not anymore. Jason's smile faded, his eyes turning cold, calculating. "Don't make me do something stupid," he muttered, his voice low. The officer hesitated, glancing between the two of them. Rachel could feel the tension building, thick and suffocating. Every instinct told her to break free, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed. The officer took a step back, assessing the situation. Rachel saw the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't sure whether to call it in or turn a blind eye. Her chest tightened, every second stretching longer than the last. Jason's hand moved from her waist slowly, deliberately, but Rachel didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, she felt the weight of the moment, the consequences closing in on her. The officer seemed to hesitate one last time. Then, without warning, his radio crackled. "Unit 12, report to Block B. We've got an incident." Rachel's eyes went wide. The officer turned sharply, nodding curtly at them both. "I'll let it slide," he muttered, his gaze flicking back to Jason. "But don't let it happen again." With one last glance at Rachel, he walked off, his footsteps receding into the distance. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, heart racing. The door clicked shut behind him. Silence. But Rachel knew deep down the damage was done. The silence in the cell felt like it was closing in on her. Rachel's breath was shallow, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Jason didn't move, his eyes locked onto hers with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her mouth felt dry. The weight of what had just happened crushed her. She had been caught, not just physically, but morally. What had she allowed herself to do? Jason took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them again. Her body tensed, but she couldn't look away. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers warm against her skin. "You know," Jason said softly, his voice smooth as silk, "you could have stopped this any time." Her heart twisted in her chest. She hated how he made her feel, like she was powerless, like he had control over her every move. But still, she couldn't move away. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I should have stopped it. You didn't," Jason interrupted, his voice dark and knowing. He stepped even closer, his breath hot against her cheek. And that was when the reality of the situation hit her, like a punch to the gut. She wasn't in control anymore. The officer had walked away, but she hadn't escaped. Jason's eyes bored into hers, as if he could see every thought racing through her mind. And suddenly, Rachel realized just how deep she had fallen into this dangerous game. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Jason's hand slid down her arm, a possessive gesture that made her skin crawl. "You should be careful," he murmured. "People like me don't forget." Rachel's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to get out, to end this before it spiraled even further. But her feet were rooted to the floor. The thought of facing the consequences, the fear of being exposed, held her captive. The air in the cell felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken threats. Jason's lips brushed against her ear, his voice a low growl. "You can't get away now. Not after everything." The words hit her like a slap. She understood now. She was in too deep. No one would believe her if she tried to speak out. Her mind raced with the possibilities, the threats, the danger, and yet she couldn't pull herself away. Not yet. The door was closed. There was no going back. And she had no idea what Jason had planned for her next. Jason's grip tightened, his presence overwhelming. Rachel could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. She took a slow, shaky breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The cell was too small, the walls too close. Every corner seemed to trap her in a web of fear and desire she couldn't escape. Jason stepped back, but only a little, just enough to let her breathe, though the tension between them still crackled. She couldn't escape his eyes. His gaze held hers, unwavering, like he was reading every fragile thought she had. "Do you think anyone will believe you, Rachel?" Jason asked, his voice softer now, almost taunting. Her chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to shout that she could get away, that she could tell the truth. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had been alone with him, alone, in a locked cell. No one would believe the truth. Her hands trembled at her sides. Jason seemed to savor her silence, enjoying the control he had over her. "I could make things easier for you," he said with a slow grin, stepping even closer, until his breath was warm against her skin again. Rachel recoiled slightly, but there was nowhere to go. She wanted to lash out, to break free, but the thought of what he might do in retaliation kept her rooted to the spot. His eyes glittered with amusement, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You don't have a choice anymore," he whispered, as if the words were a final, chilling warning. The silence that followed felt deafening. Rachel's mind raced, heart pounding. The walls seemed to close in further. Was this really how it was going to end? Trapped in this suffocating silence, trapped in this twisted game. Jason was right. She was caught, and she knew it. Her gaze shifted toward the door, the only potential escape, but the sudden sound of footsteps in the hallway shattered the stillness. Her heart skipped again. The footsteps stopped outside the cell. Rachel's breath hitched. She felt the cold sweat on her palms. Jason's eyes darkened. He moved quickly, almost too quickly. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist and pulling her to him, the motion so swift it left no time to react. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his voice a low growl. The door creaked open. Rachel froze, and then she heard the voice from outside. "Rachel? Everything okay in there?" It was the voice of another officer. She didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse. Jason didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, he pulled her even closer, his face inches from hers. "Say nothing," he ordered in a whisper, his tone dark. The officer outside waited. Rachel's mind screamed for help, for release. But her body remained trapped, held captive by Jason's unyielding grip. Would she lie? Would she tell the truth? And if she did, would anyone believe her? Her world felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The officer outside called again. "Rachel?" She felt Jason's fingers tighten, his breath hot on her ear. "Answer them, and you'll regret it," he murmured. And Rachel realized her next words could change everything. The officer's voice echoed from the hallway again, louder this time. "Rachel, are you there?" Rachel's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Jason's grip on her wrist was firm, unyielding. His breath was warm, like a silent threat against her skin. She glanced at the door, then back at him. His eyes were dark, waiting for her to speak. There was no escape. Not now. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Every part of her screamed for help, but her body refused to move, to speak. Jason's hand tightened around her wrist, pulling her even closer, his face just inches from hers. "Answer them," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. "But answer wrong, and I'll make you regret it." The officer was still waiting outside, oblivious to what was happening inside. Rachel swallowed hard. The choice was suffocating. Tell the truth and risk it all, or lie and keep the nightmare going. Jason's grip was painful now, his knuckles white against her skin. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick as the air before a storm. "Rachel?" The officer's voice, softer now, concerned. Her heart raced. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She had to say something. She had to lie. The officer couldn't know what had really happened. Not yet. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. "I'm fine," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Jason's grip loosened, but he didn't let go. The officer outside hesitated, as if trying to decide whether or not to push further. Rachel's breath was shallow, barely controlled. Jason's lips curled into a slow smile, satisfied. "You're learning," he murmured. The officer's footsteps echoed in the hall again, fading into the distance. Silence followed, and then Jason stepped back, releasing her wrist, but not breaking eye contact. Rachel stood frozen, the weight of her own lie pressing down on her chest. She didn't know what she was more afraid of, Jason's unrelenting control or the realization that she had just sold her soul. But the door was still open, the hallway now empty, and for a moment she wondered if she would ever be able to escape. Not just from the cell, but from this. From him. But for now, she was trapped. And Jason knew it. The game was only just beginning. Rachel stood still, the echoes of the officer's footsteps fading into the distance, leaving her in a suffocating silence. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the weight of her decision. Her body was trembling, every nerve on edge. Jason hadn't moved. He stood there, watching her closely, his expression unreadable. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew she couldn't. The door was still open, a sliver of freedom just beyond reach, but it felt like a trap. Jason slowly circled around her, his eyes never leaving hers. He was waiting for her to break, for her to do something, anything that would give him more control. "You're good at this," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Lying, pretending. Rachel clenched her fists at her sides. She didn't respond. Her mind raced with thoughts, but none of them brought her comfort. Jason stopped in front of her, his face inches away. She could feel the heat of his presence like a physical weight. "Don't think you're fooling me," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to pull away. "I'm not fooling anyone," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm just trying to survive." Jason's lips curled into a smirk. "Survival? That's not what you're doing, Rachel. You're playing the game." Rachel didn't know if she agreed with him or not. All she knew was that she was stuck. She was trapped in this twisted dance. And the longer she stayed in the cell with him, the more she realized there was no way out without consequences. Jason leaned in closer, his breath against her ear. "I can make it easy for you," he murmured, "but you have to play by my rules." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Every part of her screamed that this was wrong, that she needed to get out, to end this nightmare. But she was still frozen, caught in the web he had spun around her. She could feel his hand brush against her back, his touch light but possessive. Her skin burned where he touched her. "You're mine now," Jason said softly, as if the words were a promise. "And there's nothing you can do about it." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the suffocating weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this. But as Jason stepped back, leaving her with nothing but her own thoughts and the chilling truth of his words, she realized that escape was no longer an option. She was too deep in it. And now, there was no turning back. The silence in the cell was deafening, broken only by Rachel's labored breaths. She stood there motionless, every nerve on high alert. Jason's words echoed in her mind, swirling around her thoughts like a poison she couldn't shake. "You're mine now." The weight of them sank deeper with every passing second. Her chest tightened, as if the very air around her had thickened, pressing down, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to tell him to leave, to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't move. Jason's presence filled the room, a shadow that seemed to consume everything in its path. His eyes never left her, dark and unreadable. He was waiting for her. Rachel knew that. He was waiting for her to crack, to give in completely, to show him that she was truly his. And the worst part, she was scared she might. Her hands, still clenched into fists at her sides, shook uncontrollably. Her whole body screamed to escape, to do anything to break free of the hold he had on her. But the door was still open, freedom still within reach. She could still run. She could still. A sharp noise, a scraping sound, broke her thoughts. The door swung closed behind her with a sudden, jarring clang. Rachel's heart skipped. Her eyes shot to the door. It was shut, locked. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned back to face him. Jason hadn't moved. He was still standing there, watching her with that same cold, calculating look. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "And neither are you." Her chest tightened as she tried to steady herself, but it was as if the walls were closing in, forcing her into the small space, pressing the truth against her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, the sound of it deafening. She wanted to run, but she knew now there was no place to run to. Jason was right. Her options had all been stripped away, one by one, and now she was trapped by the cell, by him, by her own choices. "You should have known better than to walk in here," Jason continued, his voice calm, almost soothing, as if he were explaining something simple. "But now, you're mine." His words slithered under her skin, burning like a brand. She wanted to scream, to deny him, to push him away, but the fear kept her rooted to the spot. Jason stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of his power over her. His fingers brushed against her cheek, his touch gentle, almost tender. Rachel flinched, but she couldn't pull away. The space between them seemed to shrink until there was nowhere for her to hide, nowhere to run. His other hand reached up, slowly tracing the outline of her jaw, making her skin crawl. "You're going to do exactly as I say, Rachel," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "And if you don't—" He paused, letting the thread hang in the air like a dark cloud. Rachel's stomach churned, her mind screaming for a way out. But she was trapped, in every sense of the word, and she couldn't shake the growing realization that, somehow, she had always been trapped. The silence in the cell was deafening, oppressive. Rachel stood motionless, her back pressed against the cold door, her mind racing as her heartbeat thudded in her chest. Jason's words echoed through her mind, each one a heavy weight pressing down on her. Asterisk, you've already chosen. Asterisk. She hadn't wanted this. She never had. But somehow, she had ended up here, trapped in his game, bound by her own fear, her own weakness. The reality of her situation settled around her like a suffocating fog. She had crossed a line, and there was no coming back. Rachel clenched her fists, fighting the rising tide of panic. She wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to tear it open and run until she couldn't run anymore. But she knew that wouldn't help. She had to think. She had to fight back, even if it meant playing along with his twisted game. Her breath was shallow, each one a struggle as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. What do I do now? Jason was gone, but his presence still lingered in the room, in her mind, in her body. His touch, his words, they were like a brand seared into her memory. She slowly moved away from the door, her legs shaky, unsteady. She couldn't remain like this forever. She had to find a way out, but the door was locked. The walls were solid. There were no windows. She was alone. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was alone. Alone with Jason's threat. Alone with the choices she had made. Alone with the fear that had taken root inside her. But she wouldn't let it consume her. She wouldn't let him break her. Not yet. Rachel moved toward the small cot in the corner of the cell, the only piece of furniture in the room. She sank down onto it, burying her face in her hands, her mind a storm of thoughts and emotions she couldn't control. How did I get here? The answer was too painful to face. Jason had been methodical, patient. He had waited for her to make the wrong choice, to put herself in a position where she was vulnerable, desperate. And now, she was trapped in his web. But there had to be a way out. There had to be. Rachel wiped her face, trying to steady her breath. Her heart still raced, but she had to focus. She couldn't afford to lose control now. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the cell. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him again? Had he come back for more? No, it wasn't him. The footsteps stopped, and the sound of a key turning in the lock reached her ears. The door creaked open, and Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She tensed, ready for whatever came next. But it wasn't Jason. It was another officer. "Rachel," the officer said, his voice wary but concerned. "Are you all right?" She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She could feel the weight of everything she had been through in the last few hours, in the last few minutes. But she couldn't let them see it. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. Just tired." The officer hesitated, clearly not fully convinced, but after a moment he nodded and backed out of the cell. The door shut behind him, and once again Rachel was alone. But this time something was different. She could feel it, the tension in the air, the weight of the decision she had just made. And deep down, a part of her knew that the worst was yet to come. Rachel sat motionless on the cot, her eyes still lingering on the closed door. Her breath was shallow, each exhale laced with the bitter taste of fear and regret. The officer had left, but his presence, his concern, had been brief, barely enough to rattle her. The door clicked shut, and with that, she was alone again. But now, the silence felt different. It was no longer just a void. It was charged, filled with the weight of unspoken things. Jason had made it clear. He controlled everything now. Her mind churned with the memory of his touch, his words. Asterisk, "You're mine now." Asterisk. The phrase had become a constant echo, a haunting reminder of how deep she had fallen into his world. She wanted to shake it off, to tell herself she still had control, but each passing moment made it harder to believe. The walls of the cell seemed to close in, the small space growing more oppressive. She stood and walked over to the windowless wall, pressing her palm against the cold stone as if it could ground her. Asterisk, I have to think. I can't let him win, asterisk. She had to find a way out. She couldn't let herself be broken, not like this. But the problem was, she didn't know where to begin. Was there any hope of escape? Of getting away from him? Or had Jason already played his hand too well? The footsteps in the hallway outside the cell had grown more distant, but they still echoed in her mind. She turned back to the cot, her eyes falling on the small sliver of light under the door. That was all she had now. The faintest possibility that someone, anyone, might find a way to stop Jason. But she knew she couldn't wait for that. She had to make something happen. Rachel felt a sense of urgency rising in her chest. She couldn't be a victim. She couldn't keep cowering, waiting for someone else to make it right. Asterisk think. Think Rachel asterisk. But as much as she tried, her mind kept circling back to the same conclusion. There was no way out. Jason had everything covered. He had planted himself inside her mind, twisting everything she knew, manipulating the situation so perfectly that she could see no escape. Her heart pounded again, a frantic drumbeat that made it hard to focus. Was she truly powerless? Or was there a way to turn it around? The faint sound of a door opening in the hallway brought her back to the present. She turned toward it instinctively, her breath hitching as she listened for any signs of movement. Footsteps. They were slower this time, more deliberate. She held her breath, her pulse quickening. Could it be Jason? Or maybe another officer? The footsteps stopped right outside her cell. Rachel's stomach churned. The door creaked open again. This time, her heart skipped a beat, but the figure that stepped into the doorway wasn't Jason. It was someone she didn't recognize, a man in a uniform, but different from the officers who had come through before. He stood tall, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Rachel," the man said, his voice low, almost mechanical. "You've been left alone long enough." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, to demand answers, but her voice caught, and she remained silent, her gaze locked on him. The man stepped forward, his presence cold, ominous. "I've been instructed to make sure you understand your place here," he said, his tone chilling. "Jason will be checking in with you soon. Until then, you'll follow my instructions." Rachel felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She was trapped again. And this time, it wasn't just Jason's words that kept her locked in place. It was the fear of what would happen next. And somehow she knew. Whatever game Jason was playing, it was far from over. The man in the doorway didn't move, but the air around him seemed to grow colder with each passing second. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribcage as her eyes studied him, trying to find any sign of who he was or what he wanted. He wasn't one of the officers she had seen before. His uniform was different, more formal, the fabric darker, almost as if it marked him as someone of greater authority. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her lips. Something about his presence made her feel small, insignificant, like she didn't have a right to question him, let alone defy him. "I'm not here to play games, Rachel," the man said, his voice colder than she'd imagined. "Jason has made it clear that you belong to him now. I'm just here to remind you of that." The weight of his words settled over her like a thick blanket. She tried to steady her breathing, to fight the tightening grip of panic in her chest. She had to stay calm. She had to think. Her eyes flicked toward the door again, hoping for some way out, but it was too late. He was already inside, and the door was half closed behind him, trapping her. His cold gaze locked onto hers. "You think you can escape, don't you?" he asked, as though reading her mind. "But Jason's already made sure you're stuck here. You're not going anywhere." Rachel swallowed hard, fighting back the rising tide of fear. Escape, she thought about that sliver of freedom outside the cell, the world just beyond her reach. She had wanted to run before, but now, in this moment, it seemed almost impossible. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, and Jason's presence, the looming threat of what he could do, was suffocating. "You're not a victim here, Rachel," the man continued, stepping closer. "You're part of the equation now, and like any piece, you'll be moved at his will. Don't think you can play your own game." Rachel could feel her stomach knotting. She wanted to argue, to deny it all, but she couldn't. She was caught in this web, and every attempt to break free had only brought her deeper into it. The man took another step toward her, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Jason's waiting for you," he said, as if that simple statement should be enough to break her spirit. "Waiting for me?" Rachel whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why, what does he want from me?" The man's lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "What he wants is irrelevant. What matters is what you will do for him." Rachel shook her head, her thoughts a tangled mess. She couldn't understand it. She couldn't fathom how she had ended up here, so far removed from the life she had once known, so completely ensnared by Jason's manipulation. The man stepped back, looking satisfied at her confusion, at the tension that gripped her. "He's given you the rules," he said, his voice final. "You'll follow them, or the consequences will be severe." Rachel's body froze. The words hit her like a slap, raw and unforgiving. The consequences. Jason had warned her before, but this man's presence only made them seem more real, more imminent. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the suffocating weight of her reality. She had no control. Not anymore. The man turned and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment. "I'll leave you to think, Rachel. Jason will be by soon. Just remember," he glanced back at her with an unsettling calm, "there's no running from this." With that, the door clicked shut, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Rachel stood there, her body trembling, every thought spinning out of control. She was trapped, and no matter how much she wanted to scream, no matter how much she tried to push it all away, the truth was undeniable. Jason had won, and the worst part was, she didn't know if she could ever escape. The silence in the cell seemed to swallow everything. Her thoughts, her breath, the pounding of her heart. Rachel stood frozen for a long moment, the words the man had spoken lingering in the air like a poison that she couldn't shake. No running from this. His voice kept repeating in her head, a constant reminder of how trapped she really was, how her every move was controlled. Every step, every breath was bound by Jason's twisted game. She didn't know how much time had passed since the man left. Minutes? Hours? It felt like a blur, a fog pressing in on her from all sides, muffling everything. But eventually, the silence began to suffocate her. She had to think. She couldn't keep just standing there, lost in her own mind. Rachel turned toward the cot again, her legs shaky beneath her, and sat down. Her eyes scanned the small, grim room, bare, cold. The walls closed in on her, suffocating. But she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the fear. There had to be a way out. But how? Her thoughts kept returning to Jason, to everything he had said, everything he had done. His words were poison, yes, but they were also a tool. He was controlling her, asterisk mind, body, everything asterisk, and she had allowed it. For too long, she had let him decide her fate. Rachel rubbed her face with her hands, trying to push the suffocating pressure from her chest. She needed clarity. She needed to think about what she could do, asterisk what she still had left star. Her mind raced. There were still things she could control. Small things, maybe. Her own actions. Her choices. She could choose how she responded, how she played the game. If she was trapped, at least she could fight back. The door suddenly rattled on its hinges, a heavy sound that made her heart leap into her throat. Rachel shot to her feet, her pulse hammering. It couldn't be him. Not again. Not now. But the door creaked open, and a new figure entered. Jason. His presence filled the room, dark and commanding. His eyes found her instantly, locking onto her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, studying her with that unreadable expression. Rachel's heart pounded as she forced herself to breathe, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "I see you're still standing," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I thought you'd break sooner." Rachel clenched her fists at her sides. She wasn't going to let him see her fear. Not now. Not ever again. "I'm not broken," she spat, though the words felt weak, even to her. Jason's lips curved into a slow smile. He took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You will be," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "It's only a matter of time." Rachel swallowed hard, fighting the panic that threatened to take over. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but all she could do was stand there, locked in place by the weight of his power. Jason reached out, his fingers brushing her arm gently. The touch sent a shiver down her spine. "But for now," he continued, his voice softer, almost intimate, "you can think on it. Think about where you are, what you've done, and what you'll do next." Rachel wanted to pull away, but she held herself still, feeling like a puppet with invisible strings. His touch lingered, not enough to hurt, but just enough to remind her of how much control he had over her. She had to make a choice. She had to start making choices that weren't dictated by fear. Jason stepped back, his eyes still locked on hers. "I'll leave you to think," he said, his voice once more cold and detached. "But don't take too long. Time isn't something you have much of anymore." With that, he turned and walked out of the cell, the door slamming shut behind him. Rachel stood there, breathless, every part of her trembling. She had no more time to waste. Jason wasn't going to give her the luxury of waiting. It was up to her now, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, she finally felt something stir inside her. A flicker of resistance. She wasn't going to break. Not yet. Rachel stood alone in the cold, barren cell, her heart pounding in her chest as the door clicked shut behind Jason. The heavy silence returned, and with it, the suffocating weight of her situation. Her mind was reeling. She had thought she could keep it together, but now, more than ever, she knew that she was dangerously close to losing control. Jason had already taken so much from her. Her dignity, her peace of mind, her ability to breathe freely. He had threaded himself into every corner of her life, and no matter how hard she tried to push back, the walls seemed to close in tighter. She wasn't broken, not yet. Rachel clenched her fists, willing herself to focus. She couldn't let him win, not like this. She wasn't a victim, not anymore. She had to remember who she was before all of this. Before the walls had caved in on her, she had to fight. Somehow, her eyes flicked toward the door. The heavy metal that had once felt like an insurmountable barrier now looked like a challenge. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. Rachel took a deep breath and walked toward it, each step slow but resolute. Her pulse quickened, the anticipation thick in the air. She reached for the handle, her fingers brushing the cold metal. No, it was locked. It had always been locked. But she refused to give in to the defeat she could feel creeping inside her. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this hellish place. She had learned too much, been pushed too far, to allow herself to become another pawn in Jason's game. Rachel turned away from the door, her mind racing. She needed to think, asterisk a way out, a way to take back control, asterisk. Suddenly, she heard the faintest sound, a footstep. Then another. Her heart skipped a beat. But this time, she didn't freeze. Rachel's mind snapped into focus. She knew it could be Jason returning, or worse, another one of his silent agents sent to break her down further. But this time, there was no hesitation in her movement. She stepped into the shadows of the cell, her body pressed against the wall. Her fingers brushed the sharp edge of a metal chair leg that had been left carelessly in the corner. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she made a decision. She would fight. No matter who it was behind that door, she wouldn't be the same woman they had walked in on. The old Rachel, the broken, defeated one, was gone. And whatever came next, she would face it on her terms. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Rachel's grip tightened around the metal. Ready for whatever happened next, the footsteps grew louder. But Rachel didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her breath steady, her grip tight around the metal chair leg in her hand. She had made her decision. No longer a prisoner to fear. No longer someone who waited for someone else to make a move. The door creaked open. Rachel's heart beat in her chest, not from fear, but from a burning determination that had been smoldering inside her since the moment Jason first crossed her path. She wasn't about to let him or anyone control her anymore. The man who stepped into the doorway wasn't Jason, but his presence still carried a weight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes cold, but there was something in the way he moved, a hesitation, a slight uncertainty. He had no idea what he was walking into. "Rachel," he said, his voice cold and commanding, but his gaze flicked to the chair leg in her hand. "Don't come any closer," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. The words felt foreign, but they were the truth. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. He paused, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't move forward. "You think you can stop this?" he sneered, almost laughing at the absurdity of her resistance. "I don't have to stop anything," Rachel replied. "You and Jason can't control me. Not anymore." A flash of something crossed his face, something between anger and surprise, and for a moment he didn't know how to react. The fear he'd expected, the compliance he'd always gotten, wasn't there. Rachel tightened her grip on the chair leg. "You've underestimated me," she said softly, "and that's your mistake." In a split second, she rushed forward, using the element of surprise. Her arm swung, the chair leg slicing through the air with all the force she could muster. The man stumbled back, caught off guard by the sudden movement, and she didn't give him a chance to recover. He hit the ground with a thud. Rachel stood over him, chest heaving, adrenaline flooding her veins. She looked down at him for a moment, watching as his stunned eyes met hers. The fight had been hers this time. As the man groaned and tried to push himself up, Rachel stepped back, giving herself some space. Her breath was slow now, and her mind was clear. This wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. The start of something she hadn't felt in what felt like forever. Rachel didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how she was going to escape or how she was going to take Jason down, but she was done running. With one last glance at the man still on the floor, Rachel walked toward the door, her hands steady, her resolve unshaken. She had her freedom now, and this time no one was going to take it from her.